The blood-red sunset cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Silver Creek as Bethany Jones stumbled through the dirt, her torn dress fluttering in the hot summer breeze of 1875. Her right eye was swollen shut, lips cracked and bleeding, and her golden brown hair fell in matted clumps around her bruised face as she desperately sought somewhere anywhere to hide from the man she had foolishly married 6 months ago. Behind her, the saloon doors burst open, and a familiar voice bellowed her name. "Bethany, you get back here right now, woman!" Her heart hammered against her ribs as panic seized her limbs. Thomas had found her, the same Thomas who had seemed so charming when he'd first arrived in town from back east, with his fine clothes and promises of a comfortable life. The same Thomas who, once the wedding ring was on her finger, had revealed his true nature. A monster who used his fists to enforce his will. Bethany quickened her pace, ignoring the pain shooting through her ankle where Thomas had grabbed her earlier. She couldn't go back. Not this time. She'd rather die than endure another night of his cruelty. As she rounded the corner toward the livery stable, hoping to find a place to hide among the horses and hay, she collided with a solid wall of a man. Strong hands gripped her shoulders to steady her, and she looked up into the most startling blue eyes she'd ever seen, set in a sun-weathered face beneath a well-worn Stetson. "Whoa there, madam," the stranger said, his deep voice tinged with concern. Then his gaze sharpened as he took in her battered appearance. "You all right?" Before Bethany could respond, Thomas's voice rang out closer now. "Bethany, don't you make me chase you, girl!" The stranger's expression hardened as he looked from Bethany to the direction of the voice and back again. Without hesitation, he pulled her behind him just as Thomas rounded the corner. "Where is she?" Thomas demanded, his face flushed with drink and rage. "That's my wife you're hiding." The tall stranger stood immovable as stone. "The lady doesn't seem to want your company." Thomas laughed, an ugly sound that made Bethany flinch. "The lady? That's rich. She's my property, mister. Now step aside before I put a hole in you." The stranger's hand hovered near his holster. "I reckon not." Thomas drew his pistol, but the stranger was faster than lightning. In a blur of motion, he had his Colt in hand, cocked and aimed squarely at Thomas's chest. "I wouldn't," the stranger said calmly. "Now, back away nice and slow." Thomas's eyes darted between the gun and Bethany, who was trembling behind her protector. "This ain't over," he spat before backing away. When Thomas disappeared around the corner, the stranger holstered his weapon and turned to Bethany. His expression softened as he took in her injuries more carefully. "He'll never touch you again," he said with quiet certainty. "Not while I'm breathing." Bethany wanted to believe him, but Thomas wasn't a man who gave up easily. "You don't know him." "Don't need to. I know his kind." He touched the brim of his hat. "Name's Daniel Slater. Most folks call me Dane." "Bethany Jones," she whispered. "I need to leave town. He'll kill me if he finds me again." Dane nodded, his expression grim. "I've got a camp outside town." "You'll be safe there tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure something out." Bethany hesitated only a moment before nodding. Any stranger seemed safer than the devil she knew. As Dane led her to where his horse was tethered, Bethany cast one last glance at the town that had been her prison. Whatever lay ahead couldn't possibly be worse than what she was leaving behind. The ride to Dane's camp was silent save for the rhythmic sound of hoofbeats and the occasional cry of a distant coyote. Bethany sat in front of him on his chestnut gelding, acutely aware of his strong arms around her as he held the reins. Despite her situation, she couldn't help noticing how different his touch was from Thomas's gentle yet secure, with no hint of possession or threat. When they reached a small clearing nestled among a stand of cottonwoods near a creek, Dane helped her dismount with careful hands. "It ain't much," he said as he gestured to his modest camp, a small fire pit, bedroll, and saddlebags. "But it's safe." Bethany sank down on a fallen log as Dane busied himself rekindling the fire and tending to his horse. The adrenaline that had propelled her flight was fading, leaving her shaky and sore. "Why are you helping me?" she asked finally. "You don't know me." Dane paused in his work, his back to her. "Let's just say I've seen what men like your husband do. And I've seen what happens when nobody steps in." He turned, his expression unreadable in the gathering dusk. "You hungry?" Her stomach growled in response, and she realized she hadn't eaten since breakfast. Dane nodded and set about preparing a simple meal of beans, jerky, and coffee. As they ate, he didn't press her for details, and Bethany was grateful for the silence. It wasn't until they sat before the crackling fire, stars blanketing the sky above them, that Dane finally spoke again. "Where are you from originally?" he asked, his voice low and steady. "Missouri," Bethany replied, wrapping her arms around herself against the night chill. "My pa died in the war, and Ma couldn't keep the farm going. We lost everything when I was 14. Dane nodded, passing her his coat, which she gratefully accepted. "And your ma?" "Fever took her 2 winters ago." Bethany pulled the coat tighter, inhaling the scent of tobacco, leather, and open prairie. "That's when Thomas started courting me. He seemed so kind then." "They usually do at first," Dane said grimly. "I'm sorry." "What about you?" she asked, desperate to change the subject. "Where are you headed?" "Arizona Territory. Got some land waiting there. Good grazing, water rights. Been working cattle drives for years, saving up." He poked at the fire with a stick. "One last job to do here, then I'm heading south." Bethany nodded, wondering what it would be like to have a destination, a purpose. All she had was the desperate need to get away. "You should rest," Dane said, nodding toward his bedroll. "Take that. I'll keep watch." She wanted to protest, but was too exhausted. As she settled onto the surprisingly comfortable bedroll, Bethany watched Dane through heavy-lidded eyes. He sat with his back against a tree, revolver across his lap, his gaze scanning the darkness beyond their small circle of firelight. For the first time in months, Bethany felt safe enough to close her eyes. Morning came with birdsong and the smell of coffee. Bethany stirred, momentarily disoriented by the open sky above her. Then, the events of the previous day crashed back, and she sat up with a start. Dane was already awake, crouched by the fire with a battered tin pot. He nodded toward her. "Sleep all right?" "Better than I have in a long time," she admitted, pushing her tangled hair from her face. He poured her a cup of coffee and handed it over. "Been thinking. That husband of yours, he won't give up easy." "No," she agreed, warming her hands on the cup. "He won't." Dane's expression was thoughtful as he sipped his own coffee. "Silver Creek ain't big enough to hide in, and the sheriff's in Thomas's pocket from what I've seen." "Where can I go?" Bethany asked, fear creeping back into her voice. She had no money, no family, nowhere to run. "Been giving that some thought, too." Dane set his cup down. "I'm headed to Arizona after I finish up here. Got land there, like I said. Nothing fancy, but it's a fresh start." Bethany looked at him, uncertain of what he was suggesting. "You could come along," he continued, his voice matter of fact. "Not as anything. Just someone needing safe passage. Once we're there, you can decide what you want to do next." The offer stunned her. "Why would you do that for me?" Dane was quiet for a long moment. "My sister," he finally said, his voice tight. "Her husband was like yours. By the time I found out and got there, it was too late." He met her gaze, and the pain in his eyes made her breath catch. "I won't be too late again." Bethany nodded slowly, understanding the ghosts he carried. "When would we leave?" "Soon as I finish my business, few days at most." He stood, dusting off his pants. "For now, we need to find you somewhere safe to stay until we can go." "I can't go back to town," Bethany said, panic rising. "No," Dane agreed. "But I know someone who might help. Old friend lives about 3 miles from here. Widow woman, tough as nails. Thomas wouldn't dare cross her." Bethany's hope kindled. Maybe, just maybe, she could escape this nightmare after all. After breaking camp, they rode through rolling grasslands dotted with scrub brush and occasional stands of trees. The morning sun warmed Bethany's face as they traveled, and she found herself studying the broad shoulders of the man before her. Dane Slater was nothing like the men she knew, not brash and boastful like the cowboys who frequented the saloon, nor slick and calculating like Thomas. He moved with quiet confidence, spoke only when necessary, and his eyes missed nothing. They arrived at a neat homestead tucked into a small valley, a whitewashed cabin with a vegetable garden, chicken coop, and small barn. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, and a gray-haired woman in a practical dress was hanging laundry on a line stretched between 2 posts. She shaded her eyes as they approached, then broke into a smile. Daniel Slater as I live and breathe. Been wondering when you'd come by. Morning, Esther, Dane called as he guided his horse to a stop. Hope we're not intruding? Nonsense. Any friend of yours is welcome here. Esther's sharp eyes took in Bethany's bruised face and torn dress, but she made no comment as Dane helped her dismount. Inside the cabin, over steaming cups of tea and fresh baked bread, Dane explained the situation. Esther listened without interruption, her weathered face growing stormy as she heard about Thomas's treatment of Bethany. Well, of course she'll stay, Esther declared when he'd finished. Thomas Bennett won't set foot on my property if he knows what's good for him. You know him? Bethany asked, surprised. Esther snorted. Know him? I ran him off my land with a shotgun last year when he tried to claim my water rights belonged to him. Man's a coward at heart, all bullies are. He won't bother you here. Relief washed over Bethany. I don't know how to thank you. No need, child. Esther patted her hand. We women have to stick together out here. Dane stood, adjusting his hat. I need to get back to town, tie up some loose ends. I'll be back in a few days, then we'll head out. As he prepared to leave, Bethany followed him outside. Be careful, she said softly. Thomas is dangerous when he's angry. Dane's mouth quirked into the ghost of a smile. So am I. He tipped his hat and mounted his horse. Rest up. We've got a long journey ahead. Watching him ride away, Bethany felt both grateful and apprehensive. She was placing her future in the hands of a man she'd known less than a day, but somehow she trusted him more than anyone she'd met in years. The next 3 days passed in a blur of domestic tranquility that seemed surreal after months of fear. Esther Brooks proved to be exactly what Bethany needed, kind but no nonsense, offering practical help rather than pity. She gave Bethany fresh clothes, treated her injuries with herbal poultices, and kept her busy with chores that took her mind off her troubles. They were kneading bread dough on the third morning when Esther broke their companionable silence. You like him, don't you? Bethany's hands stilled in the flour. Who? Esther's knowing look made denial pointless. Daniel. I've known that boy since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. Never seen him take to someone like he has to you. He's just being kind, Bethany protested, her cheeks warming. Daniel Slater doesn't do anything out of mere kindness, Esther countered, slapping her dough into a loaf pan. He's got principles, that one, and when he decides someone matters, heaven help anyone who tries to hurt them. Bethany couldn't deny the flutter in her chest whenever she thought about Dane, but she quickly tamped it down. I'm still married, she said quietly. In name only, Esther replied with a sniff. Some vows aren't meant to be kept, especially when the other party's already broken them 100 times over. Before Bethany could respond, the sound of hoofbeats approached. Both women tensed until they recognized the rider, Dane, returning earlier than expected. Bethany wiped her floury hands on her apron and hurried outside. The moment she saw his face, she knew something was wrong. Thomas? She asked, her heart sinking. Dane dismounted, his expression grim. He's been asking all over town about you, offering rewards for information. He glanced at Esther, who had followed Bethany out. We need to leave tonight. I'll pack some food, Esther said immediately, returning to the house. Dane stepped closer to Bethany, lowering his voice. There's something else. Sheriff's deputized some men to look for you. Says you stole money and jewelry before you ran off. That's a lie, Bethany gasped. I didn't take anything. I had no time. I know, Dane said, his hand briefly touching her arm in reassurance. But it gives them legal cause to bring you in. We need to cross the county line before they start searching out here. As Bethany helped Esther pack provisions, a numb sort of calm settled over her. She was going to become a fugitive, running from the law based on false accusations. If caught, who would believe her word against Thomas's? By dusk, they were ready. Esther had provided Bethany with sturdy traveling clothes, food, a canteen, and even a small pistol. My late husband's, she explained as she pressed it into Bethany's hands. Every woman should be able to protect herself. The women embraced, and Esther whispered fiercely in Bethany's ear, You deserve happiness, girl. Don't you let that monster steal any more of your life. With those words ringing in her ears, Bethany mounted the bay mare Esther had insisted they take. As she and Dane rode away from the homestead, heading southwest under the cover of gathering darkness, Bethany fought back tears. She was leaving behind everything she knew, becoming an outlaw because of Thomas's lies. "We'll clear your name," Dane said, as if reading her thoughts. "Once we're safely away, we'll find a way." Bethany wanted to believe him, but her faith in justice had been severely shaken. Still, as they rode side by side through the starlit prairie, she found herself drawing strength from the steady presence beside her. They traveled through the night, following game trails and stream beds to avoid the main roads. Dane was clearly familiar with this territory, navigating confidently even in the darkness. They spoke little, saving their breath and staying alert for any signs of pursuit. Near dawn, they reached a small, hidden canyon with a freshwater spring, a perfect place to rest for a few hours. As Bethany slid from her saddle, her stiff muscles protested the long ride. She hadn't been on horseback in years, and the pace they'd kept had been punishing. Dane must have noticed her discomfort. "We'll rest here until midday," he said as he unsaddled the horses. "Need to let the horses recover too." While he tended the animals, Bethany gathered wood for a small, smokeless fire, working together without needing many words. They soon had coffee brewing and a simple breakfast of jerky and hardtack. As they ate, Bethany finally asked the question that had been nagging at her. "What was your business in Silver Creek? The job you mentioned?" Dane took a long sip of coffee before answering. "Cattle buyer. I was contracting stock for a ranch in New Mexico. Got that settled before all this happened." "I've interrupted your plans," Bethany said, guilt washing over her. "No," Dane replied firmly. "New Mexico was just a stopping point. Arizona's where I'm headed. That hasn't changed. But now you're harboring a supposed thief," she pointed out. "That could cause trouble for you." "Wouldn't be the first time I've had trouble." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Besides, I'm pretty good at staying ahead of it." After eating, fatigue caught up with Bethany. Despite her intention to keep watch while Dane slept, her eyes grew heavy. The last thing she remembered was Dane draping his coat over her shoulders as she drifted off. She awoke to find the sun high overhead and Dane scanning the horizon with a battered spyglass. "See anything?" she asked, stretching her sore muscles. "Dust to the northeast. Could be riders, could be nothing." He tucked the spyglass away. "Either way, we should move out." They packed up quickly and continued southwest, keeping to rough country where their trail would be harder to follow. As they rode, Dane shared his plans for the Arizona property, a fertile valley with good grass and reliable water, perfect for raising cattle. "It's beautiful country," he said, a rare enthusiasm in his voice, different from here, redder, more dramatic. "But a man can breathe out there, build something lasting." "Sounds wonderful," Bethany said, trying to imagine such a place. Her world had been so small for so long, first the tiny Missouri farm, then Silver Creek. "It is," Dane agreed. "Bought it from an old trapper 2 years ago. Been working drives to save enough to stock it proper." "And you'll run it alone?" Bethany asked, curious about this solitary man's plans. A shadow passed over his face. That was the idea. But land like that? It wants life on it. A family someday, maybe. The word family stirred something in Bethany, longing mixed with fear. She had once dreamed of children, a home filled with love and laughter. Thomas had crushed those dreams with his fists. They made camp that night in a dense grove of trees, using only a small fire that wouldn't be visible from a distance. After another simple meal, Bethany gathered her courage to ask Dane about the sister he had mentioned. His face grew still, but he didn't shut down the conversation. "Her name was Sarah, younger than me by 4 years, smart as a whip and twice as stubborn." A faint smile touched his lips at the memory. "She married a man named Ellis while I was away fighting. By the time I got home and found out what kind of man he really was, it was too late." "I'm so sorry," Bethany said softly. Dane stared into the flames. "Found her in their cabin. He'd beaten her so badly?" His voice faltered. "Doctor said she'd been dead about a day when I got there. Ellis was long gone." "Did you find him?" Bethany asked, though she already suspected the answer. Eventually, Dane's voice was flat. "He won't hurt anyone else." Silence fell between them, heavy with shared understanding of violence and its aftermath. Finally, Bethany spoke again. "Thank you for telling me about Sarah," she said, "and thank you for helping me. I know it brings back painful memories." Dane looked at her then, his blue eyes intense in the firelight. "You remind me of her sometimes, not in looks and spirit. She had the same courage." "I don't feel very courageous," Bethany admitted. "Mostly I feel afraid." "Courage isn't about not feeling fear," Dane said. "It's about what you do despite it." His words stayed with Bethany as she settled into her bedroll that night. She had acted out of desperation when she fled Thomas, not courage. But as she lay beneath the vast, star-filled sky, she wondered if perhaps there wasn't much difference between the two. The next day brought them to a small trading post at a crossroads, a cluster of rough buildings where travelers could replenish supplies, exchange news, and sometimes find work. Dane deemed it safe enough to stop briefly, as it was well outside the jurisdiction of Silver Creek's sheriff. While Dane went to purchase ammunition and supplies, Bethany waited with the horses, her hat pulled low over her face, despite the unlikelihood of being recognized this far from home. She watched the comings and goings of the post with interest. A group of Mexican vaqueros, a family in a loaded wagon heading west, two men who might have been prospectors based on their equipment. Her attention was caught by a conversation between two riders who had just arrived. Their horses lathered from hard riding. "Offering $50 for information," one was saying. "Husband says she stole family heirlooms before running off with some drifter." "What's she look like?" his companion asked. "Young, brown hair, pretty when she ain't all bruised up. Name's Bethany Bennett." Bethany's blood ran cold. Thomas had doubled his efforts, extending the search this far out. Worse, he was using her married name, Bennett, which made the accusations seem more credible. When Dane returned, she quickly relayed what she'd overheard. His expression darkened as he tightened the straps on his purchases. "We need to move faster," he said. "Change direction, too. They'll be watching the obvious routes to Arizona territory." They departed immediately, veering southeast instead of continuing southwest. Dane explained they would cross into New Mexico territory first, then swing west into Arizona later, a longer route, but less likely to be watched. The change in plans meant harder traveling, rougher terrain, less water, and more vigilance. By the 5th day of their journey, Bethany was exhausted, but determined not to slow them down. When they stopped to water the horses at a muddy creek late that afternoon, she splashed the tepid water on her face, trying to revive herself. "You're doing well," Dane said, surprising her with the rare compliment. "Most people would have complained by now." "I've had worse discomforts," Bethany replied, thinking of life with Thomas. Something in her tone made Dane pause in adjusting his saddle. "When did it start?" he asked quietly. "The beatings," Bethany hesitated, unused to speaking openly about her ordeal. But Dane's steady gaze held no judgment, only concern. "3 weeks after the wedding," she finally said. "He came home drunk, accused me of flirting with the butcher's son. I tried to tell him I hadn't, but he wouldn't listen." She touched her cheek reflexively, remembering that first shocking blow. "Afterwards, he cried, said he was sorry, that it would never happen again." "But it did," Dane said, not a question. "Yes. And each time the apologies got shorter until they stopped altogether." She looked down at her hands, calloused now from days on horseback. Eventually, he didn't even need to be drunk anymore. Dane was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was controlled, but with an undercurrent of rage. "Men like that don't change. They just find new victims." "I know that now," Bethany said. "I just wish I'd seen it sooner." "No one ever does," Dane replied. "That's how they trap you." As they prepared to continue riding, Bethany felt a strange lightness. Sharing her story hadn't erased the pain, but it had somehow made it more bearable. She was no longer alone with her shame and fear. They had been traveling for nearly 2 weeks when disaster struck. They were crossing a rocky plateau, the sun beating down mercilessly, when Bethany's mare stepped in a prairie dog hole. The horse went down hard, throwing Bethany clear but wrenching its leg badly. Dane was off his horse in an instant, checking Bethany first, then the injured mare. His expression told Bethany everything before he spoke. "It's bad," he said grimly. "Leg's broken." Bethany stroked the mare's neck as the animal trembled in pain. "Can we splint it? Wait for it to heal?" Dane shook his head. "Not out here, and we can't stay put that long." He met her eyes with somber finality. You know what has to happen." Tears filled Bethany's eyes as she nodded. The mare had been a good, steady companion during their difficult journey. "I'll do it," Dane said gently. "Why don't you walk a ways off?" But Bethany stayed, holding the horse's head and whispering soothing words as Dane drew his revolver. The shot echoed across the empty plateau, and then there was only silence. They buried what few supplies they couldn't carry and continued on, both of them riding Dane's gelding. The powerful horse handled their combined weight well enough, but their pace slowed considerably. By nightfall, they had covered less than half their usual distance. "We'll reach New Mexico in about 3 days at this pace," Dane calculated as they made camp. "Then another week or so to the Arizona border." Bethany nodded, too tired to speak. The day's events, her fall, the mare's death, the long hours of riding double had drained her completely. As she helped prepare their meager supper, she felt Dane watching her with concern. "You're favoring your right side," he observed. "From the fall?" She nodded, wincing as she stretched. "Just bruised, I think." "Let me see," Dane said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, Bethany lifted the hem of her shirt just enough to reveal the angry purple bruise spreading across her ribcage. Dane's fingers were surprisingly gentle as he probed the area, checking for the telltale signs of broken ribs. "Nothing seems broken," he confirmed, "but we'll need to bind it to keep it from getting worse." Using strips torn from a spare shirt, he carefully wrapped her ribcage, his touch clinical but respectful. Bethany couldn't help comparing his careful ministrations to Thomas's rough handling. It was hard to believe they were both men, so different were they in nature. As Dane tied off the last strip, his fingers brushed against her skin, and an unexpected current passed between them. Their eyes met, and for a moment, neither moved. Then Dane cleared his throat and stepped back, returning to his side of the small fire. That night, despite her physical discomfort, Bethany found herself acutely aware of Dane's proximity as they slept on opposite sides of the dying embers. She wondered if he felt it too, this growing connection between them. And if he did, what would come of it when they reached Arizona and their paths potentially diverged? The thought of separating from him brought an unexpected pang. Somewhere along their journey, Dane Slater had become more than her rescuer. He had become her friend, her confidant, perhaps something more she wasn't yet ready to name. The following day brought new challenges. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as they approached the territorial border, with steep arroyos and jagged outcroppings that slowed their already reduced pace. Water became scarce, forcing them to ration their supply carefully. By mid-afternoon, the sky to the west had darkened ominously, and the air took on the electric quality that preceded a storm. Dane scanned the horizon with concern. "Flash flood country," he explained. "We need to find higher ground before that hits." They pushed on, climbing toward a ridge that would offer some protection. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and dust. Lightning flashed in the distance, followed by the low rumble of thunder. They had almost reached the relative safety of the ridge when the first fat drops began to fall. Within minutes, the sky opened up, drenching them in a torrential downpour. The normally dry earth couldn't absorb the sudden deluge, and water began to course down the hillside in rivulets that quickly became streams. Dane urged his horse forward, fighting against the rapidly deteriorating conditions. They reached a small cave in the ridgeline just as a wall of water came rushing down the arroyo they had crossed minutes earlier. Inside the shallow cave, they dismounted, both soaked to the skin and shivering. Dane worked quickly to unsaddle the exhausted horse and rub it down with a relatively dry blanket from his saddlebags. Bethany gathered what sparse, damp wood she could find near the cave entrance, hoping it might dry enough to burn later. The storm raged for hours, turning the world outside their shelter into a chaos of wind, rain, and occasional hailstones that clattered against the rocky ground. The temperature dropped sharply, and Bethany's wet clothes clung to her like a second skin, offering no warmth. Dane noticed her shivering and frowned. "You need to get out of those wet things," he said practically. "You'll catch your death otherwise." Bethany hesitated, acutely aware of their isolation and proximity. Reading her concern, Dane turned his back. "I won't look," he promised, "but you need to change. Use my spare shirt from the saddlebag, it should be mostly dry." Still shivering, Bethany did as he suggested, quickly stripping off her sodden clothing and pulling on Dane's oversized shirt. It fell almost to her knees, smelling of tobacco and leather, and him. "Done," she managed through chattering teeth. Dane turned back, his expression softening as he took in her bedraggled appearance. Without comment, he spread their dampest clothing to dry on rocky outcroppings, then unrolled their single dry blanket. "Come here," he said, sitting down and opening the blanket like wings. "Only way we'll get warm." Bethany hesitated only briefly before sitting beside him, allowing him to wrap the blanket around them both. His body was like a furnace compared to her chilled skin, and she couldn't help leaning into his warmth. They sat in silence as darkness fell outside the cave mouth, listening to the storm gradually subside. Bethany's shivering slowly ceased as Dane's body heat enveloped her. She became increasingly aware of the strong arm around her shoulders, the steady rise and fall of his chest, the way her head fit perfectly beneath his chin. "Thank you," she said softly, breaking the long silence. "For what?" Dane's voice rumbled in his chest, vibrating against her cheek. "For everything. For helping me escape. For protecting me. For—" She paused, searching for words. "For treating me like I matter." Dane's arm tightened slightly around her. "You do matter, Bethany. More than you know." She tilted her face up to look at him, finding his eyes already on her. Intense and unguarded in a way she'd never seen before. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken feelings. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Dane lowered his head. Their lips met in a kiss so gentle it brought tears to Bethany's eyes. Unlike Thomas's demanding, possessive kisses, Dane's was an offering, a question. When they finally separated, Bethany's heart was racing, but not from fear. For the first time in years, what she felt was hope, fragile and new, but undeniably real. "I shouldn't have done that," Dane said softly, though he made no move to increase the distance between them. "You're still married?" Bethany finished for him. "Only in name. Whatever vows bound me to Thomas, he broke them long ago." Dane studied her face in the dim light. "I don't want to take advantage. You've been through hell. I'm the one who happened to be there when you escaped it." "Is that what you think this is?" Bethany asked, surprising herself with her boldness. "Gratitude confused for something else?" "Isn't it?" Dane countered, though his eyes betrayed his hope that she would contradict him. "No," Bethany said firmly. "What I feel for you has nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with who you are. You've shown me what a good man looks like, Dane. How could I not care for you?" His expression softened, and he brushed a strand of damp hair from her face. "We should get some rest," he said, though his eyes never left hers. "Long day tomorrow." They settled side by side beneath the blanket, closer than they had ever slept before. As Bethany drifted toward sleep, Dane's arm still around her waist, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. Whatever happened next, this moment, this connection was real. Morning brought clear skies, and the challenge of traversing landscape transformed by the storm. Streams had swollen beyond their banks, and familiar landmarks were altered by mudslides and debris. Their progress slowed to a crawl as Dane carefully navigated the treacherous terrain. Something had shifted between them since the previous night. Though neither mentioned their kiss, a new ease characterized their interactions, small touches as they packed up camp, lingering glances, conversations that flowed more freely. By midday, they had made frustratingly little progress. The horse was struggling in the muddy conditions, and they were forced to dismount and lead him through particularly bad stretches. Bethany's boots were caked with mud, her muscles aching from the effort, but she pushed on without complaint. As they paused to rest in the shade of a large boulder, Dane consulted his compass with a frown. "We've been pushed too far east by these conditions. Need to correct course." Bethany took a sip from their canteen. "How far to New Mexico now?" "Should cross the border tomorrow if the going improves," Dane replied, squinting at the horizon. "There's a town called Cimarron about a day's ride beyond that. We can resupply there, maybe buy another horse." The prospect of reaching civilization, even a small frontier town, lifted Bethany's spirits. She had grown accustomed to their nomadic existence, but the comforts of a real bed and hot bath held undeniable appeal. They had just resumed their journey when Dane suddenly halted. raising his hand in a silent signal for Bethany to stop. His body tensed, head cocked as he listened intently. "What is it?" Bethany whispered, instantly alert. "Riders," Dane said grimly, "coming up from the south. Get down." They crouched behind an outcropping of rocks, the horse hidden in a stand of scrub pine. Moments later, 4 riders appeared in the distance, moving at a steady pace along the crude trail below them. Bethany's breath caught as she recognized one of the men, Hank Wilson, one of Thomas's drinking companions from Silver Creek. The others were strangers, but their purposeful progress suggested they weren't simply travelers. "They're tracking us," Dane murmured, confirming her fears. "Storm probably slowed them down too." "What do we do?" Bethany asked, heart pounding. After coming so far, the thought of being caught now was unbearable. Dane's expression was calculating as he watched the riders pass below their position. "They're heading northeast. Think we kept going that way. We'll double back west, then swing north. It'll add time, but we'll shake them." They waited until the riders were well out of sight before continuing, now moving with even greater caution. Dane led them through rough country where they would leave minimal tracks, avoiding the easier paths that might be watched. By nightfall, they had covered less ground than hoped, but had successfully changed direction without being detected. They made a cold camp that night, not risking a fire that might be spotted. Huddled together beneath their blanket for warmth, Bethany couldn't stop the occasional shiver, not from cold, but from how close they'd come to discovery. "We'll make it," Dane assured her, his arms tightening around her. "I won't let them take you back." Bethany turned in his embrace, finding his face in the darkness. "What if they don't give up? What if they follow us all the way to Arizona?" "Then we'll keep going," Dane said simply. "Mexico, California, wherever we need to go to be safe." The determination in his voice steadied her. "Why are you willing to give up so much for me?" In the faint starlight, she could just make out his expression, solemn, certain. "Because some things are worth any price," he said. "Some people too." This time it was Bethany who initiated the kiss, reaching up to touch his face and drawing him down to her. Unlike their first kiss, this one quickly deepened, carrying all the fear and hope and longing that had built between them over their journey. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Dane rested his forehead against hers. "When we reach Arizona," he said, his voice low and intense, "I want you to stay, not because you need protection, but because you want to, because we could build something good together." Joy bloomed in Bethany's chest, bright and unexpected. "I'd like that," she whispered. "Very much." They crossed into New Mexico territory the following afternoon, a milestone that should have brought relief. Instead, their vigilance increased. The riders they'd spotted clearly weren't giving up the search easily. True to Dane's prediction, they reached the outskirts of Cimarron by late afternoon the next day. The small settlement wasn't much to look at: a dusty main street lined with wooden buildings, a couple of saloons, a general store, and a livery stable. But to Bethany, it represented their first contact with civilization in weeks. "We need to be careful," Dane cautioned as they approached. "Word about you might have reached even here." Bethany nodded, pulling her hat lower. Her appearance had changed considerably during their journey. Sun had darkened her skin, her once soft hands were now calloused, and she moved with the easy confidence of someone accustomed to life outdoors. Still, she kept her head down as they entered town, avoiding direct eye contact with the few people on the street. They stopped first at the livery, where Dane arranged for their exhausted horse to be fed and rested. The liveryman, a grizzled older man with only one good eye, barely glanced at Bethany as Dane negotiated the purchase of a sturdy paint mare. "Headed far?" the liveryman asked as he counted Dane's money. "Arizona territory," Dane replied casually. "Got land waiting there?" "Rough country," the man commented, "but good if you know how to work it." With the horse business concluded, they moved on to the general store. Bethany remained near the door, ostensibly examining fabric, while Dane purchased supplies: ammunition, coffee, flour, jerky, and other staples. The store owner was more curious than the liveryman had been. "You two just passing through?" he asked, eyeing Bethany with interest. "Just restocking," Dane said, his tone discouraging further questions. As they were about to leave, the storekeeper called after them. "Might want to be careful on the trails west. Had some rough types asking about a couple matching your description yesterday. Bethany froze, but Dane's hand on her elbow kept her moving. Appreciate the warning, he said calmly, guiding her outside. Once back on the street, they moved quickly toward the livery to retrieve their horses. They're ahead of us, Bethany whispered, fear clutching at her throat. And looking west, Dane agreed grimly. We'll need to change plans. They collected their horses and rode north out of town instead of west, drawing curious glances but no interference. Only when they were well beyond the settlement did Dane explain his thinking. We'll head north to Colorado Territory first, then cut west through the mountains. Longer route, but harder to track. Bethany nodded, trusting his judgment. How much longer? 2, maybe 3 weeks, Dane estimated, but we'll lose them in the mountains. The new route took them through increasingly dramatic landscapes, towering pines, rushing rivers, and snow-capped peaks that seemed to touch the sky. The beauty would have been breathtaking under other circumstances, but Bethany could never fully relax, always expecting to see riders appearing on their trail. They encountered few people, an occasional trapper, a small group of Ute Indians who watched them pass without interference, and once a lone prospector who shared his campfire and stories of the gold rush days. None seemed to recognize Bethany or show undue interest in their journey. Gradually, as the days passed without sign of pursuit, Bethany began to hope they had truly escaped. Their routine had become comfortable riding by day, making camp at dusk, sharing quiet conversations by the fire, and each night they slept closer, their embraces becoming more intimate though never crossing the final boundary that Bethany's technical married status still imposed. One clear evening, as they camped beside a mountain stream filled with trout Dane had skillfully caught for their supper, Bethany found herself imagining a future beyond their journey, a home with Dane on his Arizona ranch, perhaps children someday, a life built on mutual respect rather than fear. "What are you thinking about?" Dane asked, noticing her thoughtful expression as he banked the fire for the night. "The future," Bethany admitted. "Our future, if we make it to Arizona." Dane moved to sit beside her on the fallen log that served as their bench. "When we make it," he corrected gently. "Not if." "When," Bethany agreed, leaning against his shoulder. "Tell me more about your land. What will we build first?" Dane's arm came around her waist as he described his plans: a small cabin to start, then a proper ranch house as the herd grew, corrals and a barn, maybe an orchard where the land dipped toward the creek. Bethany closed her eyes, letting his deep voice paint pictures in her mind of the life they might share. It was the closest thing to peace she had felt in years. The sound of the shot shattered that peace like glass. The bullet struck the log inches from where they sat, sending splinters flying. Dane was moving before Bethany could even process what had happened, pulling her to the ground and covering her body with his own as a second shot kicked up dirt nearby. "Stay down," he ordered, drawing his revolver and returning fire toward the tree line across the stream. Bethany's heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed herself into the earth. 3 more shots rang out in quick succession, one clipping Dane's hat as he raised his head to aim. "Can you make it to the horses?" he asked, his voice tight as he reloaded. Bethany glanced toward where their mounts were tethered 20 yards away, dangerously exposed. "I think so." "On my signal," Dane said. "I'll cover you." He fired twice more into the trees, then shouted, "Now!" Bethany scrambled to her feet and ran, expecting at any moment to feel the impact of a bullet. Behind her, Dane's gun barked repeatedly, keeping their attackers pinned down. She reached the horses, hands shaking as she frantically untied the reins. From across the clearing came a cry of pain. One of Dane's shots had found its mark. Taking advantage of the momentary confusion, Dane backed toward Bethany, still firing strategically to cover his movement. "Mount up!" he called. "We'll head up the stream bed harder to follow in the dark." They swung into their saddles and spurred their horses into the shallow water, riding upstream as more shots rang out behind them. The moon provided just enough light to navigate by, but the rocky stream bottom made for treacherous going, forcing them to move slower than Bethany would have liked, with bullets still occasionally whistling past. After what seemed like hours, but was likely only minutes, the shots faded behind them. Still, Dane kept them moving, leading them up a steep game trail that branched away from the stream and into denser forest. Only when they had put several miles between themselves and their campsite did Dane finally call a halt in a small clearing screened by thick pines. Both horses were breathing hard, sides heaving from the difficult climb. "Are you hit?" Dane asked urgently, dismounting to check Bethany for injuries. "No," she assured him, though she was shaking from reaction. "You?" In the dim moonlight filtering through the trees, she saw him grimace. "Just grazed," he said, touching his left arm where his sleeve was torn and darkening with blood. Bethany immediately slid from her horse and went to examine the wound. It was as he'd said, a bullet had scored a shallow furrow along his upper arm, painful but not serious. "We need to bandage this," she said, tearing a strip from her petticoat as she'd seen him do for her ribs earlier. As she worked, Dane kept his eyes on the forest around them, alert for any sign of pursuit. "That was Thomas," he said grimly. Recognized his voice when he yelled. Cold dread washed through Bethany. "How did they find us?" "Bad luck," Dane replied. "They must have been searching north as well as west." He winced slightly as Bethany tightened the makeshift bandage. "We need to keep moving. They'll be on our trail at first light." "You're hurt," Bethany protested. "You need rest." Dane shook his head. "We're too close to letting them catch up. We can rest when we're deeper into the mountains." Reluctantly, Bethany agreed, and they remounted, continuing their ascent into the high country. They rode through the night, following game trails and mountain streams, always climbing higher. The air grew noticeably cooler as they gained elevation, and Bethany found herself grateful for the warm coat Esther had provided. Dawn found them traversing a high alpine meadow, the valley they'd left far below, now shrouded in morning mist. They paused to rest the horses and to assess their situation. "We've got maybe a 2-hour lead," Dane estimated, studying the back trail through his spyglass. "They'll be following, but it's harder tracking up here, less sign to follow." Bethany nodded, too exhausted for words. The night's events had drained her completely, and the thin mountain air made each breath an effort. They rested only briefly before continuing, now heading west across the rugged spine of the mountains. Dane set a punishing pace, clearly intent on widening the gap between them and their pursuers. By midday, they had descended slightly into a sheltered valley with a small, crystalline lake. The horses desperately needed water and rest, so they stopped, though Dane positioned them where they could see any approach. As Bethany knelt by the lake to refill their canteens, movement at the far end of the valley caught her eye. Her heart sank as she made out 4 riders entering from the east. "Dane," she called softly, pointing. He followed her gaze, his expression hardening. "Mount up. We'll head for those rocks," he said, indicating a tumble of massive boulders on the western slope. They had just reached the shelter of the boulders when a shot rang out, echoing across the valley. Their pursuers had spotted them and were now galloping toward their position. Dane helped Bethany dismount and led both horses deeper among the rocks. "Stay here," he ordered, checking his revolver. "I'm going to try to hold them off." "That's suicide," Bethany protested. "There are 4 of them." "And only one way up through these rocks," Dane countered. "It's a good defensive position. I can keep them pinned down until dark, then we can slip away." Before Bethany could argue further, he pressed a quick kiss to her lips. "If anything happens to me, keep heading west. 2 days' ride will bring you to a settlement called Pine Creek. Ask for Marshal Davies, he's a good man. He'll help you." With that, he moved away, positioning himself behind a boulder that commanded the approach. Bethany wanted to call him back, to insist they flee together, but she knew he was right. Their only chance was to stand and fight from this position of strength. Minutes later, the shooting began. Dane was a skilled marksman, making each shot count. From her position, Bethany could see their pursuers taking cover behind trees at the base of the slope, occasionally firing upward but mostly staying hidden. The standoff continued for hours, neither side gaining an advantage. As the sun began to lower toward the western horizon, Bethany's hope grew that Dane's plan might work. If they could just hold out until darkness, they could escape. Then she heard a scrabbling sound from the rocks to her right, away from where Dane was focused. Someone was circling around, climbing the backside of their rocky shelter to flank them. Without hesitation, Bethany drew the small pistol Esther had given her. She had never fired a gun before, but Dane had explained the basics during their journey. Taking a deep breath to steady her hands, she moved toward the sound, staying low among the boulders. A figure appeared on a rock above her, one of Thomas's hired guns, rifle in hand as he prepared to shoot down at the unsuspecting Dane. Bethany raised her pistol and pulled the trigger. The gun bucked in her hand, the sound deafening in the confined space between the rocks. The man cried out, clutching his shoulder as he lost his balance and tumbled down the rocks, his rifle clattering away. The unexpected shot from behind drew the attention of the other attackers, momentarily confusing them exactly the diversion Dane needed. He seized the opportunity to pick off another of their pursuers, who had unwisely exposed himself, trying to see what was happening. Now the odds were more even, 2 down, 2 remaining, one of whom was Thomas. Emboldened by their success, Bethany moved to join Dane at his position. "Good shooting," he said with grim approval, "but it'll be dark soon. We should try to slip away while we can." As if in answer to his words, clouds that had been building all afternoon suddenly unleashed a downpour, the rain reducing visibility to mere yards. Thunder cracked overhead, and lightning illuminated the valley in strobing flashes. "Now's our chance," Dane decided. "They can't see or hear us in this." They hurried back to where the horses were sheltered, mounted, and began to pick their way down the western slope of the valley. The going was treacherous and the rain rocks slick, trails turning to mud, but the storm that hampered them would also cover their tracks. They had nearly reached the valley floor when a flash of lightning revealed a rider directly in their path. Thomas, his face contorted with rage as he raised his rifle. "Bethany," he shouted over the storm, "you're coming home." Dane immediately pushed his horse in front of Bethany's, shielding her with his own body. "It's over, Bennett," he called. "Let her go." Thomas's laugh was ugly. "She's my wife, my property. I'll do what I want with her." "Not anymore," Bethany said, finding her voice at last. She guided her horse alongside Dane's, refusing to hide. "I'm never going back to you." Thomas's face twisted with fury. "Then you'll die here with your lover," he snarled, raising his rifle. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Thomas fired, the muzzle flash bright in the gloom. Dane's horse reared in panic, nearly unseating him. Bethany heard the bullet whistle past, missing them both. Before Thomas could chamber another round, Dane had drawn and fired. The shot struck Thomas squarely in the chest, throwing him backward from his horse. He lay still in the mud, rain washing the blood away almost as quickly as it appeared. Silence fell, broken only by the continuing patter of rain and occasional rumble of distant thunder. "Is he?" Bethany couldn't finish the question. Dane dismounted and approached the fallen man cautiously, gun still drawn. After a moment, he looked back at Bethany and nodded once. Thomas Bennett was dead. A complex wave of emotions washed over Bethany, relief, shock, and a strange sense of emptiness where fear had lived for so long. She didn't mourn the man who had caused her so much pain, but neither did she celebrate his death. The fourth member of their pursuers was nowhere to be seen, having apparently fled during the confusion of the storm. Dane quickly searched Thomas's body, finding a wanted poster with Bethany's description and the false accusations Thomas had spread. "Evidence," Dane explained as he tucked it into his saddlebag, "to clear your name when we reach civilization." They didn't linger. With one last glance at the man who had been her husband, Bethany turned her horse west. Whatever guilt or grief she might feel could wait until they were safe. They rode through the night, the storm gradually giving way to clear skies studded with stars. Neither spoke much, each lost in thoughts about what had happened and what it meant. By dawn, they had put many miles between themselves and the valley where Thomas had died. They made camp in a sheltered grove of aspens, both too exhausted to continue without rest. As Dane built a small fire to ward off the morning chill, Bethany finally broke their long silence. "It's really over, isn't it?" Dane looked up, his face softened by the golden light filtering through the aspen leaves. "Yes," he said simply. "You're free." Free. The words seemed to hang in the air between them, full of possibility. Bethany tested the feeling, searching for the guilt or regret she thought she should feel at Thomas's death. But all she found was a profound sense of relief and something else, something growing and hopeful that centered on the man across the fire from her. "What happens now?" she asked softly. Dane's eyes never left hers as he answered. "Now we go home, to Arizona, together." He paused, then added with uncharacteristic uncertainty, "If that's still what you want." Bethany rose and moved to his side of the fire, kneeling before him and taking his hands in hers. "It's all I want," she said, "a home, a life with you." The smile that transformed his face was like sunrise after the longest night. He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Perhaps to him she was. "I love you, Bethany Jones," he said against her hair. "Have since the moment you stood up to Thomas in that alley, beaten but not broken." Tears filled Bethany's eyes, not tears of pain or fear, but of joy so intense it almost hurt. "And I love you, Dane Slater, for seeing me when no one else did, for believing I was worth saving." Their kiss sealed the promise between them, a beginning rather than an end. The remainder of their journey to Arizona passed without incident. They traveled at a more leisurely pace now, no longer fugitives, but simply a couple heading home. They passed through small settlements where Dane occasionally took odd jobs to supplement their funds, and where Bethany began to rebuild her confidence in dealing with strangers without fear. In a frontier town called Flagstaff, they stood before a justice of the peace who, after reviewing the evidence of Thomas's crimes and confirming his death, declared Bethany legally free to remarry. The simple ceremony that followed, witnessed by the local schoolteacher and blacksmith, was everything her first wedding should have been, filled with genuine love, mutual respect, and joyful anticipation of the life ahead. Dane's land, when they finally reached it after nearly 2 months of traveling, was everything he had described and more. The valley nestled between red rock formations, with a year-round creek winding through lush grassland perfect for the cattle Dane planned to raise. A stand of cottonwoods provided natural shelter for the small cabin they would build first, with room nearby for the larger ranch house they would construct as their family and fortunes grew. Standing on a rise overlooking what would become their home, Bethany leaned against her husband's strong shoulder. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "I can see why you fought so hard to get here." Dane's arm tightened around her waist. "Not half as hard as I fought for you," he replied, "and worth every step of the journey." As the sun set behind the distant mountains, painting the landscape in hues of gold and crimson, Bethany thought of the long road that had brought her here, from frightened, abused wife to confident, beloved partner. The scars of her past would always be with her, but they no longer defined her future. "He'll never touch you again," Dane had promised that first night, and he had kept that promise through danger, hardship, and sacrifice. But he had given her something far more valuable than mere protection. He had given her back herself, and with it, the courage to love again. Together, they would build something lasting in this wild, beautiful land. A home, a family, a legacy of love that would heal the wounds of the past and illuminate the promise of tomorrow. Bethany Jones Slater was finally home.